Welcome everyone. This is Sean from Giant Leap, and today we're very happy to be joined by JpegAPE from DAO. So some of you might know that DAO is an ecosystem on Arbitrum, and they have game cartridges. Is that correct? Is that what I'm referring to it correctly, JPEG?
Yeah, exactly right. It's kind of console cartridge sort of concept.
Awesome. And they have a bunch of really cool games on their ecosystem. I was playing The Beacon for a long time when it first came out. And they also have the Magic currency, which I guess is the interoperable currency across all of their games, which is really cool. And I'll let JpegAPE talk a bit more about that soon as well. But welcome to our little podcast.
Cool. Thanks for having me, guys. Excited to be here and always keen to to be discussing, where the state of the kind of Web3, Web 2.5 gaming, whatever you want to call it, industry. And super excited to connect.
Awesome. So how I like to start is just to sort of get a feel for like how you actually, what sort of games did you sort of grow up playing? Because I think that's always a good way to sort of find out a bit more about who we're talking to.
Yeah, so I grew up, I'm from Australia, grew up in Perth, Western Australia. Kind of grew up playing MMORPGs. So RuneScape was kind of number one.
Awesome.
Probably favorite console I would say is PlayStation 1. Funnily enough, I've been back and forth with Andrew Green from Strider DAO recently, just on some like memes of the early Harry Potter game. So like Hagrid and Snape, and that was kind of fond memory of gaming for me. And then kind of lost touch a little bit with gaming just as I went through uni, and I actually played a fair bit of poker. So game theory
Cool.
is something that I'm really interested in, and kind of psychology and motivation and the behavior behind it. And then kind of went through uni, got a job in started out in the recruitment industry, kind of progressed to Web 2 SaaS, and was with my last company for 5.5 years, kind of running go-to-market, and joined as employee number 2. So inevitably that didn't give me a huge amount of time to game, but kind of saw the groundswell starting to form in this space, and been in crypto for a fair while now, so naturally got interested, and that's kind of here we are now.
Fantastic. And one of the things I've always noticed about people in Web3 is that we have obviously there are lots of diverse backgrounds, but there's always, I find, more of an overlap of people that either played a lot of games growing up, or did things like played poker, or I think I've spoken to like a few people now that used to play poker, even semi-professionally, and I think that intersection of like finance and gaming and those kinds of things really draw us to Web3, don't you think?
Totally. There's such a big overlap. Mainly, I mean, I've really noticed it within the crypto / poker ecosystems. There's just naturally like given that there's a speculative element of both, but there's also kind of like a skill and game theory advantage to be gained if you kind of put in the work. There is a lot of people that grew up on poker that either still play or maybe play less, that are like very directly or indirectly involved in crypto. I suppose we're seeing some spillover from that naturally to gaming at the moment, just because there's a lot of capital entering the space, and there's a lot of opportunity. We can probably touch on the good and the bad of that. There's probably some bad actors that are trying to value extract from the space, but naturally, when there's investment in an industry and it's quite new, there's going to be a lot of spillover from sort of adjacent verticals as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know that many people still consider crypto to be a crypto casino effectively. And that's definitely the first, I think I saw a tweet the other day that said, the first utility of crypto is currency, and everyone was like, what do you mean? It's not currency, it's speculation. Currency is like 4,000 down the list or something, and I had a pretty good laugh at that. But I think what I'm finding now, I've having Maresh and I have been building in the space for quite a few years, especially in DeFi. The people that have stuck around I'm seeing more and more of us come to terms with, okay, we can't just keep going on the same merry-go-round, play the same Ponzi schemes, play those same games. And it's not the reason that we actually got into the space, right? I'm sure many of us got into the space because we're like, okay, cryptocurrency is so cool. It's going to fundamentally change the world. We didn't all say, hey, let's make a more efficient global casino. And I think on-chain gaming and Web3 gaming in particular is like where we see this little ray of hope for like builders to sort of really sink their teeth into. I mean, because we all play games, I think we should appreciate that how hard it is to create a good game, right? Like games as software is probably one of the most difficult things you can build. So I think it's really good to sort of have people spend that brain space there now instead of just sort of making more efficient Ponzi schemes is what I'm finding.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's something to be said about user experience as an overarching concept, right? So if you think about UX, like for an infrastructure perspective, it's really hard for us to onboard traditional gamers into the market right now. And, you know, I use an example like the Beacon, which is a super fun game in the Treasure ecosystem, had huge adoption within kind of the Web3 native ecosystem, but there's a lot of friction points. So like as a user coming from Web 2, let's just say I hear about the Beacon. So I land on, you know, the Beacon web app. I get prompted to create a wallet, and I'm like, what the hell is a wallet? Like I have no idea what this thing is. So I'm either going to churn there, or I'm going to create a wallet, but then I've got to get, you know, Ethereum onto the wallet, and I've got to do that in layer 2. And so I don't know what the hell layer 2 is versus layer 1. And then I've got to create an exchange account, or like, you know, on ramp with MoonPay, which, you know, there's a propensity to not do that because it's too hard. So there's all these different points of friction. And so when you think about the overall addressable market right now, it's very much the Web3, like the speculator crowd, people that are filtering over from NFTs and, you know, other maybe DeFi as well, where they're trading and they're trying to make a profit in the short term. And so I think the thing about a lot of the games that are being built out right now is that they're really built around these financial primitives as a primary. And you know, if a game has a token, inherently there's an easy way to off ramp that token into fiat currency or Ethereum, and then kind of like port the Ethereum over to a DeFi protocol and start trading. So there's not a lot of retention that's innately built into these products. And so what I'm really excited for is and I'm pretty vocal about it on Twitter, is seeing a lot more projects that think about non-financial primitives as like a primary mechanism that drives their game. And so I think the Beacon, what they did really well was, you know, there's no token, there's no currency, there's no speculation element. Like you can argue that playing the dungeons and answering the tavern questions daily, like players are doing that to earn raffle tickets to then potentially get a whitelist spot for the eggs. So there's an element of speculation on potential future value, but it's not like they can buy X and then play the game and then off ramp rewards into Y token. So I think the Beacon got that really, really right, and they've been able to create this, you know, incredible organic parochial community off the back of that.
No, absolutely, and I completely agree with all of those sentiments. And one of the things we're focused on as well is, yeah, like you said, we sort of fall into the trap of assuming that quote unquote normies just kind of know what we know about the space. But then once you sit down and break down all the things that we have to do just to connect to a MetaMask wallet and have enough gas in there to do something, that already sort of, you know, excludes a huge number of people. So definitely burner wallets or account abstraction and those kinds of things are necessary to try and bring in people who just want to come and play the game, right? They just want to create an account, you know, because that's what they're used to. They don't want to have to deal with wallets and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think that's even necessary for a lot of the time. You can abstract away a lot of those things.
Yeah. We actually, just to touch on that very quickly, just to shill a little bit, we actually announced this morning our partnership with MetaFab, which is a really amazing group group of builders, I should say, that are really working hard on that kind of that middleware side of things. So, abstracting away gas, abstracting away wallets, transactions, and really like removing a lot of the inherent friction that exists from onboarding traditional gamers into the ecosystem. So we're super excited about, what that's going to look like in the short, the medium, the long term. And, my goal in my role at Treasure is to continue to onboard great builders and great teams, game devs, to build and release and distribute their products in our ecosystem. And inevitably, if we can make it easier for players to come in, then that creates more value for our builders. So super excited about what that's going to look like.
No, absolutely, and we'll definitely have to check that out ourselves. One of the things I want to touch on a bit more is the hyper financialization of games, and you talked about how Beacon did it in a way so that it wasn't getting in the way of the fun game loops of the game, right? Because we all know what happened to Axie. We all know what happened to a lot of these big games that did exceptionally well when we were in a bull market, but then like when their tokens crash, it actually destroys the game sometimes as well, right? Now there's an argument for people to say, okay, well, why even be a Web3 game if you don't have tokens as ownable assets that you can then take in and out of the game and do all those kinds for? What's your take on how game developers or gamers should balance these two things?
Yeah, it's a it's a really tricky question to answer. I think for starters, probably the start point is really thinking about why do we need a token? So, what is the utility that the token has in the game? And then, if there is a good use case for that, then how do we then look at the tokenomics of the token and sort of like the supply emissions schedule, and I suppose like the ownership distribution and also like the sinks and the faucets within the game. Like, does it make sense for players to spend the token in the game, or is it just going to be primarily a value extraction mechanism? I think there's a lot of, as I touched on before, there's a lot of projects that are launching right now that haven't really intentionally thought about that. And there's also kind of an incentive for projects to raise capital via a token allocation. So, they spin up a token, they sell a component to investors, they raise capital to fund OpEx for the project. And I think that mindset is very short-term focused, and it kind of can inevitably just lead to the crash and burn of the project. And there's probably also something to be said about the regulatory landscape right now. It's, I've spoken to a bunch of founders over the last couple of weeks in particular, and they've kind of shelved their plans to produce a token just due to the the macro environment, and B, the regulatory environment. Probably additional to the regulatory side, if you create a token and it is there's a couple of different models. There's sort of like a single token, dual token, number of others. But if you create a single token model and that token goes to zero and your player base just completely churns because there's no incentive for them to play the game anymore, you pretty much kill the project. So there's also that like big brand risk that you take in designing a token. So what we're kind of encouraging founders to think about is, as I said before, like non-financial primitives. What can you do to incentivize gameplay via non-off-rampable tokens? So, experimenting with different standards is potentially one. The analogy that I think about is, back in the day, in the early parts of our society, like we used shells as a medium of exchange or a means of exchange. And so that was like yes, it's a financial primitive, but it meant that inherently it was a lot harder to game the system. Like clearly there was entrepreneurial people that, went and created enterprises around farming shells and things, but it was a lot harder to do than manipulating the financial system that we have today. And so thinking about, ERC 1155s as one example, or 721s, like different primitives that aren't directly sort of like they're not fungibly tradable for US dollars or for Ethereum, and players aren't easily able to off ramp and then take their value elsewhere. So that's kind of the overarching mindset that we're trying to encourage within the Treasury ecosystem to definancialize gaming. I know that was a lot of talk, so hopefully some of that made sense.
No, absolutely. And I think that's definitely the correct way to think about it as well. And you know, I mean, we've come from DeFi, so we know that as soon as something can happen, something can be exploited. And I don't just mean the protocol being hacked, but like any kind of angle someone can have within DeFi, because the tokens are so liquid and interoperable with each other, it will happen, right? And that's not what you want in a game. So, you know, in World of Warcraft, for example, we know there are gold farms. We know that you can buy the items outside of the game. But as you said, it's not sanctioned. It's not easy. No one can just go onto Uniswap and then put like the gold tokens there, right? It's still, there is still some friction to sort of do that. And that's not what most players do. Most players still play WoW as a normal player. And that's what makes it enjoyable for other people that play. So you're absolutely right. That's the balance that you have to keep. And you know, sometimes it's such a huge thing to think about. So we know that for us at Giant Leap, we're not even thinking about having tokens at this stage, because as soon as you do, you need to think about all those other things, right? Like sinks, faucets, and balancing. And we'd rather focus on how to make a fun game loop at this stage.
Yeah, and probably just the other part of that is that I think a lot of founders that maybe are coming from Web 2 into Web 3 and want to create some form of financial primitive at the start of their game, they also have probably a lack of understanding about just like how perverse some of the players in crypto are. Like there's an opportunity to game or to farm the system. You bet your horse that bet on the horse that the players are going to do that, right? Like
absolutely.
So many bots and farms, and you know, not to touch on any regions or any demographics in particular, but like there are, you know, countless examples where you know, there's just these huge syndicates or like rings of farms that just extract all the value and destroy all the fun for people that might be playing for, you know, for genuine reasons. And again, like it's another thing that just, it can sink a project so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Because people will, the good and bad thing about crypto is that anyone can access it more or less. And people, you know, people forget that people everywhere in the world will try to optimize their own outcomes. So they if they can make more money doing something that, you know, is at the expense of your fun, obviously that's going to be more important for them, and that's what's going to happen. So that's just
the reason I touched on the demographics is I think it's an important point to consider, because, you know, living in Australia, if we have the ability to like farm a game for, you know, $3 an hour, it's not a good risk reward for us. Like our time is better spent doing other things, whereas there's areas in the world that, you know, that is literally like a good monthly wage, and the cost of living differential makes it a completely different equation. And so while we sort of like don't think about it from a farming perspective, we may just play the game because we enjoy it, and there may be like a small amount of money that you can make if you're a top performer, but we don't consider the other side of the coin, that like, you know, that while we have the attitude that it's not worth pursuing this financially, there are so many other people in the world that it is worth pursuing financially for. And so I think that's maybe something that we don't consider as well when we're designing these games and thinking about sort of like the token element.
Absolutely. So would you say that it's not inherently bad to have some financial, so how should I put this? Let's say we want to reward players for playing. Is it just a matter of making sure that those rewards are incentivized to playing the game so that it's still fun for yourself and everyone else, versus having some way to exploit the game's resources, I guess, at the expense of the gameplay itself?
Yeah, no, I think having some sort of financial incentive is completely fine. It's just how that's designed and what the distribution of that is. Like if you it kind of has to be zero sum. Like if the value of the money, how do I put this? If the value of the if the sum of the value extracted is greater than the sum of the value that's going into the game, then you kind of have an imbalance, and it's kind of designed to go to zero. Whereas if you have, for example, like a meritocratic system or like a skill-based game where, you know, the top X% are able to earn a decent amount, and then sort of like there's a constituent under that that people can still earn, but it's just not as anywhere near as much. But then there's a large percentage of the pool that's not earning anything or contributing money. That's a healthy economy. And that's, you know, if you think about golf as one example, you know, you've got amateur golfers that all pay to play the game. You know, you go to your course, you hit some range balls, you pay $15 for a bucket, you go and play a round, it's $50 to play a round, you buy your clubs, you don't have sponsorships. So like you're paying to play that game, but then you've got sort of the semi-competitive tier where there might be some prize pools offered and you can maybe like break even after expenses. Then there's like the semi-pro or like the bottom end of the pro, in which some people make some money, but you know a lot of people break even. And then there's the pro level where, you know, there's still people that aren't earning a huge amount, but most of the population there is you know, net positive. But there's a few players that are earning ridiculous amounts. So that's kind of a stable economy. And I think the same thinking needs to be applied to gaming as well.
100%. And I think a lot of us in crypto, and I know a lot of users in particular, kind of lost sight of what it meant to build a actual business. Because when farming was all the rage, right? People were like, no, you should be paying me to use your protocol with 10,000% APY. That's why I'm here. You know, it's like, don't worry about like me paying you because you're giving me value. It's all about what can you give me? And because, you know, we're in a bull market and there was just, you know, people raising money from VCs and private funds, and they were just, it was like, it's not a sustainable business to go out and hand money to people to use your product, right? So that's the thing that we forgot. And you know, Beacon was a great reminder of that. It's like, okay, this is the price to play the game, and if you think this is a good game, then you'll pay the price to play it.
Yeah, and there's also something to be said there about free to play, because you want it to be a democratic model. Like you want to give access to everyone if it's a fun game, right? There's a lot of people that played the Beacon and never converted to a founding character purchase, which was $40. In fact, there probably wasn't that many because they had a really strong conversion funnel, but inevitably there was still players that were playing for the fun of it. But there was a clear incentive for players to purchase a founding character because people liked to decorate their house and, you know, put cosmetics on their character. And, you know, there was all these subgroups that formed around, like there was the naked subcult thing that, you know, players would either purchase or earn via the loot boxes, these like naked skins for their character. And then all these, or a subgroup formed around that. And it was like quite a funny thing on Twitter. So that was kind of one incentive. And then B, they had the ticketing system. So, you know, you earn raffle tickets for successful completion of the dungeon or answering a question in the tavern. And so as a free-to-play character, you don't earn raffle tickets, so you can't earn a pet mint or a golden egg. And so that kind of, you know, naturally we saw a really strong conversion from free-to-play to pay-to-play. But, you know, there was always the premise, or there was the expectation was managed with the paid players that they're not guaranteed a mint. There was 45,000 mints and only 4,000 or 4,100 eggs. So A, you're not guaranteed, like it's kind of RNG. And B, you can't, if you purchase a founding character, you're not going to be able to sell it in this period up until, I think it's end of this month, is when trading is enabled. So they set the expectation really early, and players, I think, appreciated that. So that they knew what they were getting themselves into.
Definitely. So I think that's a good segue into a couple of things. One is from Treasure DAO's perspective and your position in Treasure DAO, where do you see And we'll talk about the future, but like, where do you see the state of Web3 gaming is right now? Like, where do you see it as in terms of, let's say, getting more mainstream adoption from Web2 gamers?
I think we're not quite there. So what we're seeing is that there's a real influx of Web 2 builders coming into the space, whether it be discreetly and in a stealth kind of mode, or being overt about it. There's still a good degree of capital allocation, so still a lot of venture activity. I would say this year we're going to see a lot of products released. There's probably a lot of teams that have been building for the last 1 to 2 years and are getting to a point where they're ready to release and have people consume the product. But there's still, I think one of the most exciting things for me is there's this real groundswell of indie devs that are starting to enter. And I think Web3 presents probably the most upside for the indie category. There's clearly a lot of AAA games and studios that are building in this space now and being quite overt about it. But for me, like I was talking to the CEO of a 150 odd person studio in the UK, and he's built this, or their studio's built this incredible like 500k MAU or DAU, I think it is, mobile app, mobile game. And he's really interested in Web3 from a distribution perspective, because there's just so much like rake in the Web2 world. It's very hard to create a profitable business in gaming in Web2, in particular in the mobile category. So Web3 kind of democratizes the distribution, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Apple side of things. But I think over time, there won't be such a monopoly on distribution, and there's going to be a lot more ways to sort of acquire users more sustainably, less cannibalistically, and a lot more cheaply for particularly the indie side of things. So it's cool to see so many indie builders coming in and like being able to capitalize on the new forms of monetization and user acquisition. And it's a lot more democratic environment to build in versus building in Web2 and competing against their well-funded competitors.
Absolutely. And so distribution is one thing, but what would you say, in your opinion, like what makes a Web3 game?
That's a really good question. I think, one thing is ownership, right? I can't remember the examples. I think it might be Diablo. I might be wrong there, but there was examples of players purchasing items and the developer basically changing the aesthetic. Like there's one example where I think the item gave the player too much utility of camouflage within the game. And so the developer like removed the component of camouflage off it, so that, they basically toyed with the metadata after the purchase, and the players were like super unhappy about that. So I think giving people true ownership of the purchases and the items that they acquire through gameplay is certainly one. I think a lot of people are thinking about Web3 from the wrong lens. Like they're thinking about it from, like a very financial, primitive, first principles perspective, and, the ability to kind of make money in the short term and be very value extracting. But I think what is possible in Web3 is different forms of monetization and new ways to acquire users in more novel ways, and less about like having to be predatory when it comes to monetizing. And I think it unlocks a lot of new opportunity for game developers to connect, engage, iterate their product really quickly, and fast feedback loops with their audience that you don't really see in Web2. Probably the other part of that is Web2, probably a blanket statement, but Web2 companies don't really give a shit about their community. They care about monetization and turning a profit and paying executive bonuses. Whereas in Web3, like, there's an example, a guy called Mike from Dimension X. He's building over on Flow at the moment, but maybe potentially somewhere else soon. We'll see. But he's an example of, he's the CEO of their studio, their traditional Web2 builders. They've come into the space, and he's like in the weeds in their Discord every day, listening to users. They've got kind of 1,200 to 1,500 DAUs generally, and he's in the trenches, like listening to what the players are saying about the game, and that gives them this really informed product direction of where to build and the experience they want to create for their users. So I think that's unique to Web3 as well. Yeah, a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, fantastic. And do you see decentralization being important at all, or do you think that's not something that gamers really care for at this stage?
Yeah, it's again another interesting one. Decentralization, I think, is so we're structured as a DAO, right? And I think what that means is that we can transparently we reinvest a lot of the revenue that we earn back into sort of strengthening the treasure ecosystem, the treasure flywheel. So from that perspective, I think decentralization is really interesting. I think like there's another probably separate note slightly about permissionlessness versus permissioned. We brand ourselves as a decentralized ecosystem of games. I think that we have to have some form of permission in that system for us to make sure that there's a values alignment between the type of experience that our players want and the type of experience that our builders are providing. We want to kind of safeguard and protect the players within the treasure ecosystem from any kind of perversely incentivized builders to come and extract value. And so we kind of have to have an element of centralization in that. But that being said, I think what we're trying to do over time is build more decentralization into the decisions we make. And so an example of how we're doing that is we're about to go live with our game builders program, and there's going to be multiple tiers that govern how we partner with projects. At the top, you've got like very deep integration with Magic and treasure resources and interoperability and using all of our tooling. At the bottom, you've got kind of like the grassroots building cohort, and we're experimenting with potentially like gauging access to that tier through a decentralized voting structure where stakers or G Magic holders, so stakers of Magic, are able to vote on which builders get accepted into the ecosystem. And so it's less about us having centralized control over that and more about giving our community the voting power to make those decisions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That sounds is it similar at all to Steam's early access program, where they get, if you get enough community votes, they'll sort of put your game up for early access?
Yeah, we're drawing a lot of inspiration from what Steam has done, and a little bit from the Epic Games Store side of things, from our infrastructure suite, but similar sort of vein of thought.
Yeah, fascinating. And the reason I ask you these questions is because we've been building in the space as well, and one of the critical decisions we had to make early on is, do we make what we call a Web 2.5 game, a centrally run game that we can just build with existing engines like Unity, for example, and then have some kind of NFT integration on there? Or do we just sort of bite the bullet and go into the deep end of fully on chain, where we believe the rule set is on chain as well? And the rationale we came up with was, unless we're big game developers, we can't really compete with the Web 2 games out there, because Web 2 games are, they're done by seasoned professionals. There's very robust infrastructure. It's very hard to sort of just compete in that space, right? Whereas for Web3, the point of difference, in our view, is that permissionless extendability of the game, right? So I think what you mentioned was, you do need some kind of UI level control, right? Especially if you're running a brand like Treasure, you need some kind of quality control at the UI side. But if everything is, if the rule set for the game, for example, is built on the blockchain, then anybody can really access it, and then anybody can build their own UI for it if they wanted to. Kind of like how we viewed DeFi dApps back in the day. The contracts are live. Anyone can build their own front end if they felt so compelled to do so, and the contracts are just live and running forever. So we really like the term autonomous worlds, because once you deploy that world, it just sort of takes on a life of its own. And that's not to say that you'll automatically get traction or users, but there's every chance that it does. And then other people can start building on top of that as well. And who knows what your game looks like in a few days or a few weeks or a few months. It could be left undiscovered for years, and then someone's like, oh, I'm going to build this thing on this thing now because it exists. So that's what we're really fascinated about and interested in exploring.
Yeah, makes sense. I had a really interesting conversation with the guys over at Playmint the other day, building the crypt, and yeah, their whole ethos around permissionlessness, permissionless systems, and creating kind of like, you know, the base. My interpretation is that they're creating like the base rules that govern their world, and then leaving the rest kind of up to people to build on top of, which is a really fascinating and very nebulous concept. Like I still am kind of wrapping my head around what that can look like in practically. But yes, I'm a big fan of projects like yourself that are building fully on chain, and I think it's probably like a smaller addressable market right now in terms of kind of adoption of players. But I think
Absolutely.
as time goes on, probably has a really unique chance at kind of creating a like legendary game that withstands time. So yeah, I think there's certainly like a lot of merit to building like fully on chain, fully permissionlessness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely a small addressable market, and I think most of the market can't even tell the difference really between, you know, what we're doing and other Web3 games out there, because the benefits are not so obvious right now. And I think it can only really become more obvious as more and more people start to sort of join the ranks, and then one day discover that their favorite game is actually a plugin for another game that's existed. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like this kind of like meta and a meta kind of thing. A good analogy I like to think of is, you know, would people have cared about the first Teslas that came on the road if they weren't better than many ICE cars, right?
Yeah.
It's like you can't just be worse by every metric and then say, oh, we're fully on chain and therefore you should care about us, because gamers don't care about that, right? You have to provide some kind of experience that they can't get with a AAA game or even a 2.5 game. And it's only then when it starts to click for those people that you can start to really break through, I think, as a fully on-chain game.
Yeah, and I think it's not about, so it's about the the degree of improvement as well. It's not about fully reinventing the wheel. It's just about creating an iteratively improved experience, and sort of like focusing on the core elements that gamers don't like about Web 2, and then layering them on in Web 3 because it's possible. You know, like a lot of you know, speaking about decentralization, like a lot of what Web 2 gamers hate about some games that they play, like, you know, they obviously spend a lot of time playing the games, but, you know, deep down they hate various aspects. Part of it is, you know, the unwillingness of the developers to listen to and incorporate their feedback into sort of future game loops or future development. And then secondly, it's kind of that very financial first, like profit at all costs mindset. And probably also, you know, that ties into that is that very walled garden player ownership model, where, you know, developers and makers of games are disincentivized to be able to work together and create like interoperability, as another kind of topic that we can potentially dive into, because like the financial incentives are preventative of thinking about those things. Whereas in Web3, like, because there's different distribution means that are possible and different user acquisition tactics that are untenable in Web 2, there is actually like deep incentive for builders to collaborate if the right environment is created for it to happen and for them to do so. So I think that's probably another point that I missed on what's unique about Web3 is that, you know, builders can actually collaborate and work together and create really fun experiences that aren't even possible in Web 2.
100%, and that's one of the things I'm really excited about. And I've been having fantastic conversations with not only other game developers, but just even other NFT communities that, fit within the whole, our game is in space because of course it has to be because we're all space geeks. But there are so many other IP out there, right, that can just fit into our lore, or we could make up some lore on the spot and make it fit, right? And then there's presents this whole opportunity of why that community would care about our game in the first place. So for example, we have factions in our game, and one of the cool things we'll be rolling out is if you run a DAO, or if you have another game, for example, that could be one of the factions in our game. And that faction will actually be run as a mini DAO, and the players who go about their goals and make money for the faction can then go ahead and decide what global tech tree they might like to invest in for the betterment of the entire DAO. So all of these things are like inherently unique to Web3 gaming, because WoW is never going to go to Counter-Strike and be like, hey, let's collab together, right? Let's do something. It just wouldn't make sense. But I think that's the real opportunity of Web3. It's that modability and extendability. And speaking of mods, I think it's so many big games today were mods, right? When they started off. I mean, just Counter-Strike as an example, and WoW and Dota and all those kinds of games. And every time a new mod comes out, the player base moves. And there's kind of like this disconnect there between the original game that it came from. And I think and I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, is like, does Web3 gaming also present a better opportunity for a more cohesive player base that isn't splintered every time a new game comes out?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways that I can riff on this one. I think there's probably something to be said about the various ecosystems that exist right now. Like there's not a lot of cohesiveness or ease of transferability across, Polygon, Solana, Arbitrum at the moment. And I think a lot of that has to do with the inherent friction that onboarding has in its pathway at the moment. So what I kind of mean by that is, if I want to play a game on Polygon or on Arbitrum, like it's kind of a different onboarding experience, and it's kind of hard for me to port between the two. I think over time, as that friction starts to, I think multi-chain, from what I've noticed so far in my journey, multi-chain tends to be a user acquisition play for games, right? So when they say that they want to go multi-chain, it's generally because they want to increase their total addressable market. But I think what they're failing to realize is that it's kind of a pretty bad decision to be making right now, just because the cultural differences, the onboarding differences, the user experience differences, it's not as easy as just like plugging and playing into these different ecosystems. And so coming back to your original question, I think it's important to be intentional about like where you build and the kind of overarching like community vibe that exists within the ecosystem there. And I think for us, that's become like a really compelling driver of value for builders to build within Treasure, in that, there's a lot that kind of locks players into the whirlpool, so to speak. Infrastructure wise, we're building this proof of play system, which is a really powerful like cross-game funnel for players to discover new titles in the ecosystem, and we can incentivize them to do that. They can earn like XP points, rewards, badges, equip their kind of gamer tag, so to speak. And so that forms like this really strong retention mechanism and engagement mechanism. And then you also look at, Magic as kind of I think about Magic as like, you walk into an arcade and you've got tokens that you can play different games within the arcade using. And so it's very easy for me to port between different games. I can purchase items from different games and starting characters in different games via Magic, via the one marketplace interface. And so although these builders are building games that aren't necessarily deeply connected right now, the ease of transport for a user between them is a lot easier than anything else that I've seen. And so Yeah, I'm probably answering your question in a very roundabout way, but I think there's something to be said about, if there's mods and there's new versions of games that are created, but they're in different ecosystems, maybe it's kind of very hard to like transfer users from one game to another. Whereas if you build within one cohesive and collaborative ecosystem, then inevitably there's going to be sharing of player and audience and kind of spill over from game to game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're talking about discovery as well versus technology, right? Because obviously, just because it exists and it is Web3, it doesn't, there's still a lot of noise out there. We're not only competing with other games, but all other forms of media, right? Would someone rather be watching Netflix right now than signing in and playing our games? So discoverability is certainly a big thing. And that's something I have noticed with Treasure DAO. I think because the Beacon were promoting one of the other games recently off their Twitter account, right? Which I don't think they had any sort of overlap with, other than the fact that they were both Treasure DAO ecosystem games.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk in the general like crypto Twitter sphere about the concept or the notion of a rising tide floats all boats, and I love that I love that little notion, or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's not overly applicable in a lot of ways. I think where it is especially applicable is within Treasure, because builders are literally incentivized to grow the total pie, and whether that means retweeting another project's updates, or like collaborating with a project from an interoperability standpoint, the more eyes and the more players that we can attract to this ecosystem, inevitably the better discovery they're going to get, and the more engagement they're going to get from shared audiences. So I think it's a really powerful like flywheel effect that we're starting to create.
That's fantastic. And I think on that note, that was a very good place to leave off our chat. So really good to have you here, JpegAPE, to share a bit more about your history in Web3 gaming, as well as what you're doing with the Treasure DAO ecosystem.
Yeah, appreciate the time. It was it's always really cool to kind of just sit back and be able to riff on a lot of these different concepts. And I think my closing thought would just be that this space is just moving and evolving so rapidly, and no other market in the world is open 24/7, or that I'm aware of anyway. And so there's things that happen day to day, week to week, and month to month is a crazy thought. Even like 1 month here is kind of a year in a lot of other worlds. So really keen to be part of the space and building alongside you guys and everyone else. And it's a really exciting 2023 ahead of all of us, and keen to revisit some of these ideas and thoughts at the end of this year, to see kind of where we've gotten to.
Definitely. Awesome.